I want to tell you a story about two universities back in the 1950s, Princeton and Dartmouth. The students of these two universities saw a football game, or rather they saw two different games. In one game, the Dartmouth team played dirty. They tackled Princeton's star quarterback well after he had thrown a pass, giving him a concussion, breaking his nose, and taking him out of the game. In the other game, it was the Princeton players who were playing dirty. They injured one Dartmouth player's leg and broke another's. Now, these two games were actually happening at the same time, and at the same place, and with the same players and referees. Actually, the only thing that made these two games different was which team you happened to be a fan of. If you were a Princeton student, you thought the Dartmouth team made twice as many infractions, and the infractions they did make were flagrant. And if you were a Dartmouth student, you thought that the two teams made about the same number of infractions, and the Princeton students were exaggerating how flagrant the infractions actually were. Now, what really happened in this game isn't all that important. What's more important is what we can learn from it. Despite seeing the exact same game, the two teams came to radically different conclusions. And it shouldn't surprise you now when I say that our political arena is split in much the same way. Both sides see the other as hateful, malicious, and stupid, and they see their own side as righteous and rational. And this problem only seems to have been getting worse over the past couple decades. In a recent Pew survey of 10,000 Americans, they asked Democrats and Republicans how favorably they viewed the other side. In 1994, when this question was asked, 16% of Democrats and 17% of Republicans viewed the other side very unfavorably. In the most recent survey, these numbers have jumped up to 38% and 43% respectively. Now, one of the consequences of this ideological divide that I found especially interesting is how it affects our understanding of science. On issues as diverse as evolution or climate change or fracking or genetically modified organisms, we see people vehemently disagreeing with each other and with a scientific consensus. Before I move on, though, I want to emphasize that this kind of polarization is actually quite rare. When we get a bad infection or break a bone, we go to the doctor because we know that's the relevant expert to go to. We don't form conspiracy theories about a cabal of scientists trying to manipulate our understanding of our health and well-being. And the same is true for any number of scientific topics, like how long tortoises live, or whether or not Pluto is a planet, or how to make a light bulb. For all these topics and more, our political ideology doesn't affect how we look for and interpret that information. It's only on these rare issues like climate change or GMOs where we see this kind of polarization. Nonetheless, the fact that our political affiliations can affect how we think about scientific evidence should trouble us. If we want to build a world that's open to the discoveries of science, we should worry when we start thinking of science like a football game with winners and losers. It doesn't matter what happened in a game over half a century ago, but it does matter whether or not our Earth is warming. And it does matter whether or not our foods are poisonous. Regardless of your political orientation, we can all agree that the answers to these questions matter. Where we disagree is in what we think the answers are. And in some cases, liberals diverge from the scientific consensus, and in others, conservatives do. If we can understand why this happens, perhaps we can change it so that all Americans can come to a better appreciation of the amazing insights that science has to offer. Now, the problem isn't that we don't have any explanations for why this polarization occurs. The problem is actually that we have too many explanations, that each have a ring of plausibility to them. So to disentangle one explanation from another, we have to turn to the evidence. So I'll be talking about two explanations today. One explanation is what's been called the public irrationality thesis. And I think the best work that's been done on this topic has been by Dan Kahan at Yale University. And the idea behind the public irrationality thesis is that people get things wrong about science because they don't think like scientists. Maybe they're less knowledgeable or lack the analytic or reflective kinds of mindsets that scientists are known for. And this is what causes them to be uninformed or easily misled by people who want to manipulate them. Like I said, this is a plausible explanation, but how might we test it? Well, if the public rationality thesis were true, we might expect that as a person became more knowledgeable or better at interpreting quantitative information, their beliefs would converge towards the scientific consensus. But this actually isn't what we find. As a person becomes better along these dimensions, we actually see greater polarization. So on a topic like climate change, for example, conservatives will believe even more that climate change doesn't pose a risk to humans, and liberals will believe even more that it does. So this seems like an anomaly for the public rationality thesis. You can't easily explain this pattern of results. But there is another explanation. It's called the cultural cognition thesis. And the idea here is that our beliefs might not just be tracking the truth. Instead, we might be motivated to form our beliefs in a way that signals our commitments to our identities and to the people with whom we share a relationship, in short, our culture. And as a person becomes more knowledgeable or better at interpreting quantitative information, they're better at finding the evidence that fits their worldviews. So it's like if one of those Princeton students watching the game was wearing binoculars. They'd be much better at seeing what was happening on the field and much better at seeing all the other team's faults. But at the same time, by wearing those binoculars, they would have been so intently focused on whatever it is that they wanted to find at the exclusion of everything else. And if you're a Princeton student, you're going to want to find all those times when the Dartmouth team is acting unfairly. And you're going to want to find all the excuses for your own team. And so now, to return to the cultural cognition thesis, the reason why we see greater polarization as people become more scientifically literate or numerate is because the world is complicated. And there's always going to be mixed evidence, and we're motivated to find the evidence that fits with our worldviews. It's just that the people who know more and who are better at deliberative reasoning are better at finding that evidence. This is a plausible and evidence-based explanation for why America is polarized over issues that should ordinarily be in the domain of science, not politics. It's because we're motivated to be good members of our group, and because positions on certain scientific topics come to be markers of which group we belong to. I want to emphasize, though, that fitting your observations to your worldviews isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in some cases, it can make complete sense. So if you're a Princeton student watching the game, it might not be in your best interest to say, actually, guys, our team was acting a little aggressively. That's how you lose friends. And similarly, when you're a conservative down in Texas, it might not be in your best interest to say that you're in favor of gun control. You might get suspicious glances, people might question your motives, and you might get shunned or ostracized from your group. And the same might be true if you're against gun control in Virginia Tech or Newton, Massachusetts, the sites of 2 horrible mass shootings. At best, what do you gain by adopting these beliefs? Your individual voice isn't going to sway policies, and you aren't going to live your day-to-day life any differently as a result of understanding the science behind gun control. You aren't going to cook dinner better, and you aren't going to watch more entertaining TV shows. All you really gain is the satisfaction of knowing that you're right. But collectively, when politicians institute policies that reflect the will of their biased constituents, we can get policies that don't reflect the consensus of scientific experts. And we can get policies that damage the lives of thousands, if not millions of people. So how might we change this? Well, I'm not sure I have the answers, but I do know that this kind of polarization isn't inevitable. In one of the studies Dan Kahan conducted with his colleagues, he measured how curious people were about science. Among other things, he asked people what kinds of books they read and how often they went to museums and public lectures and how often they talked to their friends and family about science and technology. And what he found was as people showed greater curiosity in science, the less polarized they became. What this suggests is that other motivations, besides our desire to affiliate with our group, can affect how we perceive scientific facts. It turns out an appetite for surprise and wonder can work to mitigate our tendency to engage in biased reasoning. So, stepping back now from the individual level, we can look at the cultural meanings associated with positions on certain scientific topics. In another study Kahan conducted with his colleagues, he gave people an excerpt saying that the effects of climate change would be even more dire than scientists had previously predicted. But before doing so, he gave them a statement, ostensibly written by the American Association of Geophysical Scientists, either urging even stricter restrictions on carbon emissions, or a statement calling for greater investments in geoengineering as an alternative to these carbon emission restrictions. When participants read the statement on geoengineering, we saw less polarization, and the conservative participants were more willing to admit the possibility that climate change might actually pose a risk to humans. Again, the reason behind this is because climate change took on a different meaning for these participants. By appealing to geoengineering, these researchers appealed to the value that conservatives place on overcoming nature's limits through commerce, technology, and industry. And with this in mind, accepting climate change became less of a threat to these conservatives' identities, and so their evaluation of the evidence was less distorted by their commitments to their cultural worldviews. So the broader point is that if you want even a slim chance of changing a person's mind on some politically contested scientific topic, the first step is to understand why people hold the beliefs that they do. It might not be because they're stupid, but rather because they're smart. It might be because they know how to evaluate the evidence, consciously or not, in a way that affirms their commitments to their cultural worldviews. And so one way to get this broader understanding is to actually engage with people that you disagree with. And I don't just mean turning on Fox News or MSNBC. I mean actually talk with people, have cross-cutting conversations with people from across the aisle. You'll improve your ability to articulate the reasons why people hold the beliefs that they do, and who knows, you might even improve your understanding of your own views along the way. And finally, once you do understand the people that you're talking to, use that understanding to strip the issue of its antagonistic cultural meanings. Climate change and GMOs or any other scientific topic doesn't have to be a liberal or conservative issue. Politics is about how we as a nation should respond to the way the world is. But the way the world is doesn't care if you're a liberal or conservative. The oceans will rise or fall regardless of your political ideology. But like I said, the insights of science matter here. Both liberals and conservatives have a stake in knowing what the truth is. So instead of the win-lose kinds of conversations that political pundits typically have, an emphasis on this cooperative pursuit of the truth might work better. It might be more effective in changing people's minds. So science doesn't have to be a football game. It's more like a three-legged race, except instead of everyone racing against each other, everyone's legs are tied together, and we're all just struggling to get to the finish line. And so we have to coordinate and cooperate with each other if we want to move in the right direction. And realizing this is the first step towards bridging the ideological divide and building a more enlightened society that's able to take full advantage of the discoveries of science. Thank you.